Hey, stop scrolling for a second. She pretended to choke on the spicy food, then blamed the maid in front of the billionaire. A woman grabbed her throat at a dinner table worth more than most people's houses. She pointed at the maid. She said one word, poison, and a family's whole world nearly fell apart because of it. But here's the part nobody at that table knew yet. The maid had a secret. And so did the woman gasping for air. By the end of this story, you'll understand why some of the quietest people in the room are holding the biggest truths. Stay with me. This gets unbelievable. Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments, I really do read them. Today's story is one of those emotional, heart-tugging tales about pride, class, and the kind of quiet courage that doesn't ask for applause. It's about a woman who wore diamonds like armor, a maid who wore humility like a shield, and a billionaire who was about to learn the difference between people who serve you and people who truly see you. I promise you, this one has a twist you will not see coming. Let's get into it. Nobody in that dining room knew the plate of pasta on the table was about to change 4 lives forever. The Sterling mansion sat on 11 acres outside Greenwich, Connecticut, behind gates that opened only for people who mattered, or people who worked for people who mattered. Richard Sterling, 42 years old, was the kind of man Forbes wrote profiles about. Self-made, though self-made, was generous. His father had left him a modest logistics company that Richard turned into a shipping empire spanning 3 continents. He wasn't born rich. He remembered poor. He just didn't talk about it anymore. Tonight, the chandeliers were dimmed just enough to look intimate and just bright enough to show off the silverware. Richard sat at the head of the table in a navy suit. His tie slightly loosened, the only sign that after 14 years of building an empire, he still didn't quite believe he belonged in a house this large. Across from him sat Vanessa Cole, his fiancée of 8 months, in a champagne silk dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves, her smile was practiced, camera-ready, the kind of smile she'd worn since her modeling days in Manhattan. And near the kitchen doorway, refilling water glasses with careful, quiet hands, stood Maria Gonzalez. Maria had worked for the Sterling household for 6 years. She'd started as a part-time housekeeper when Richard's mother, Eleanor, was still alive and fighting a losing battle with pancreatic cancer. Maria hadn't just cleaned that house. She'd nursed a dying woman through her final 18 months, feeding her broth when she couldn't keep anything else down, reading her old letters aloud when her eyes grew too tired to read them herself, sitting with her at 3 in the morning when the pain made sleep impossible. Richard had been in Singapore closing a deal the night his mother passed. Maria was the one holding Eleanor's hand. He never forgot that. But lately, he hadn't exactly remembered it either. Not with the wedding planning, not with Vanessa's constant redecorating, not with the whirlwind of a life that moved too fast to look backward. Maria was 44, a single mother raising a 15-year-old son named Diego on a housekeeper's salary in a 2-bedroom apartment 40 minutes from the estate. She rode 2 buses to get to work every morning before 6. She never complained. She barely spoke unless spoken to. And Vanessa Cole had made it clear in 100 small ways that she found Maria's quiet presence unsettling, the way you might find a persistent itch unsettling, something beneath your notice that still manages to irritate. "The pasta tonight," Vanessa said, swirling her wine, "is arrabbiata. I specifically told the chef, spicy but not overwhelming. I have a very sensitive palate." "You always did like things dramatic," Richard said, smiling, reaching for his own plate. He didn't notice the way Vanessa's eyes flicked toward Maria as she said it. He didn't notice the small, cold smile that followed. Vanessa had been planning this dinner for 3 days. Not the menu. The moment. She had learned, through careful and quiet questioning of the household staff, that Maria's son Diego had a full scholarship interview coming up for a prestigious private academy in 2 weeks. An interview that required, among other things, a clean record for his mother's employment and a strong reference from the Sterling family. Vanessa also knew something else. Richard had recently mentioned, almost offhand, that he was thinking of setting up a trust for Diego's education. Eleanor would have wanted that, he'd said. Maria gave up so much for this family. Vanessa had smiled at the time. Inside, something cold had curled tight in her chest. She did not like sharing Richard's gratitude. She did not like sharing anything. Dinner continued. Candlelight flickered against crystal. Richard talked about a new shipping route through the Panama Canal, animated in the way he only got when he talked about work. Vanessa laughed at the right moments, touched his arm at the right moments, played her part beautifully, as she always did. Then, halfway through the second course, Vanessa set down her fork. Her hand rose slowly to her throat. "Richard," she said, her voice thin and strained. "Richard somethings." She coughed. "Once. Her breathing hitched, sharp and shallow, theatrical in a way that would have looked to anyone watching closely, just slightly too rehearsed. But nobody was watching closely. Richard shot up from his chair so fast it toppled backward onto the marble floor with a crack that echoed through the dining hall. "Vanessa. Vanessa, look at me. I can't breathe." Her eyes were wide, glassy, darting toward the kitchen doorway where Maria stood frozen, water pitcher still in her hands. "The food," Vanessa gasped. "Something's wrong with the food." And then, in a voice loud enough to carry through the entire house, Vanessa pointed one trembling, manicured finger directly at Maria. "She did something to my plate." The room went silent except for the sound of Vanessa's ragged, performed breathing, and the sound of a water pitcher slipping from Maria's suddenly numb hands, shattering against the marble floor. The shattering glass seemed to freeze time itself. Richard's head snapped toward Maria, his expression a storm of confusion and fear he couldn't yet separate from each other. "Maria, what did you?" "I didn't do anything, Mr. Sterling. I swear on my son's life I didn't." "She's choking," Vanessa cut in, her voice climbing, each word sharpened like a blade. "Richard, call someone, call an ambulance. She put something in my food. I know she did. She's hated me since the day I moved in." It wasn't entirely a lie. Maria hadn't hated Vanessa. But she had watched her quietly for 8 months, the way you watch weather rolling in, with a wary respect for what it might become. She'd watched Vanessa dismiss 2 housekeepers before her, watched her berate the landscaping crew until 3 of them quit in a single season, watched her smile at Richard with a warmth that never once reached the rest of the staff. Maria had never said a word about any of it. Not one word. She needed this job. Diego needed this job. Richard, meanwhile, was on his knees beside Vanessa's chair, his hands hovering uselessly, his mind racing through every first aid class he'd never actually taken. "Are you choking? Can you breathe at all? Do you need the Heimlich? Someone call 911. "I called already, sir," said James, the butler, appearing in the doorway with a phone pressed to his ear, his voice steady in the way only decades of service could produce. "Paramedics are 6 minutes out." 6 minutes. In 6 minutes, Vanessa's breathing began, almost imperceptibly, to steady. Her coughing softened. Color that had never actually left her face began, if anything, to look more natural. But nobody was watching for that. Everyone was watching Maria, standing in the doorway with broken glass around her feet, her hands shaking, her face pale with a fear that had nothing to do with Vanessa's throat and everything to do with her son's future. "I only put in what the chef prepared," Maria said quietly, more to herself than anyone. "I don't cook, Mr. Sterling. I only serve." "Then why?" Vanessa gasped, clutching her chest for effect now more than necessity. "Why did I see her, near the kitchen, alone before dinner?" "Because I was setting the table," Maria said, her voice cracking now, not with guilt but with the particular exhaustion of being disbelieved. "I am always alone in that kitchen, Miss Cole. It is my job to be alone in that kitchen." Richard looked between the 2 women, his fiancée, gasping and pale in her $10,000 chair, and his housekeeper, trembling in the doorway with shattered glass at her feet, and for the first time in 8 months, something in him hesitated. Just slightly. Just enough that Vanessa noticed it and didn't like it. "Richard," she said, softer now, reaching for his hand. "I'm not saying she meant to hurt me. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe she got confused with the spices. But I can't have someone working in this house who I can't trust around my food. You understand that, don't you?" It was a masterful sentence. It gave Richard an exit that didn't require him to accuse anyone of anything. It let him protect his fiancée without publicly condemning a woman who had cared for his dying mother. Vanessa had learned, over years of navigating rooms full of powerful men, that the cruelest things could always be dressed as reasonable. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes later. By then, Vanessa's vitals were, unsurprisingly, perfectly normal. "Mild reaction, possibly to capsaicin," one paramedic offered. "Some people have a lower threshold. I'd recommend an allergy panel, but she's stable now." Stable now. As if she had ever truly been unstable. Richard walked the paramedics out. When he returned to the dining room, Vanessa was sitting calmly, sipping water, her composure fully restored, as though the last 20 minutes had been a minor inconvenience rather than a woman nearly accusing another woman of poisoning. "I think," Vanessa said carefully, not looking at Maria, "that for everyone's safety, she shouldn't work here anymore." Maria stood very still. 6 years. 18 months at Eleanor's bedside. 2 buses every morning. A son with a scholarship interview in 14 days that required, among its many requirements, a stable and verifiable employment reference for his single mother. "Please, Mr. Sterling," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I need this job." Richard looked at her. Then at Vanessa. Then down at his own hands, as if the answer might be written somewhere on his palms. "I need some time to think," he said quietly. "Maria, please go home for tonight. We'll talk tomorrow." It was not a firing. But to Maria, standing in a doorway with broken glass at her feet and her whole future suddenly balanced on a rich man's uncertainty, it felt exactly like one. Maria didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table in her small apartment, the fluorescent light overhead humming faintly, staring at a stack of unpaid bills she usually kept in a drawer so Diego wouldn't see them. Diego was asleep down the hall, unaware that his mother's job, and by extension, his scholarship interview, his future, the entire fragile architecture of the life she'd built for him, might be gone by morning. At 11:47 p.m., her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Gonzalez. My name is Priya Shah. I'm the head of security systems for the Sterling estate. I need to speak with you. It's about tonight. Please call me when you can, no matter how late." Maria's hands trembled as she dialed. Priya answered on the first ring. "Mrs. Gonzalez, thank you for calling. I want to say first, I believe you. And I have proof." Maria sat down slowly. "Proof of what?" "The dining room has security cameras. Not for surveillance of the family. Mr. Sterling had them installed 2 years ago after a break-in attempt, mostly covering entry points, but the dining room camera catches part of the table for insurance and liability reasons, in case of accidents with the antiques. I reviewed the footage tonight because, frankly, something about the way it happened felt off to me. I've worked security for wealthy families for 11 years. I know what real medical emergencies look like. And I know what performances look like." Maria's throat tightened. "What did you see?" Miss Cole excused herself to the powder room roughly 90 seconds before her plate was served. When she returned, she was carrying something small in her hand. I can't tell exactly what from the angle, but it's clearly not empty when she sits back down, and her hand is empty by the time the chef's assistant brings out the food. There's a moment right before she starts coughing, where she reaches toward her own plate and her hand moves in a way that's deliberate, sprinkling something. Then 30 seconds later, the coughing begins. Maria felt something in her chest. Not triumph, not yet, but the first small loosening of a fear that had been crushing her ribs since 7 o'clock that evening. "Why are you telling me this? Why not tell Mr. Sterling? There was a pause on the line. Because I don't know if he'll believe it from me. I'm staffed too, Mrs. Gonzalez. And Miss Cole has already gotten 2 people let go this year for far less than accusing her of something. I need you to know the truth exists. What you do with it, that's your choice. I'll send you a copy of the footage tonight. Time-stamped, unedited. You do whatever you think is right. But I couldn't let you go into tomorrow thinking you were alone in this. After the call ended, Maria sat in her kitchen for a long time, the phone screen glowing in her hands, a video file downloading slowly on her aging data plan. When it finally finished, she watched it 3 times, her hand pressed over her mouth. There it was. Small, quick, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Vanessa Cole's hand, moving over her own plate, sprinkling something from a small paper packet before slipping it into her clutch purse. 31 seconds later, the coughing began. Maria didn't cry, not right away. She had spent 6 years learning how to hold her feelings very still, the way you hold a full cup of water so it doesn't spill. But then she thought of Diego, asleep down the hall, dreaming of a school he might never attend because a woman in silk had decided a housekeeper's silence was worth less than her own comfort. And something in Maria, something that had been quiet for 6 years, patient for 6 years, careful for 6 years, finally cracked. She wasn't angry only for herself anymore. She was angry for every time she had made herself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. At 1:15 a.m., Maria did something she had never done in 6 years of employment. She wrote an email, not to Richard's personal assistant, not through the usual chain of household communication, but directly to Richard Sterling himself, to an address she'd only ever used once, when Eleanor was dying and someone needed to reach him urgently overseas. The subject line read, "Regarding tonight. Please watch this before you decide anything." She attached the video. She did not add a single word of explanation. She let the footage speak for itself. Then she closed her laptop, walked down the hallway, and stood in Diego's doorway for a long moment, watching her son sleep, before finally allowing herself, quietly, to cry. Richard Sterling was not a man who cried easily, but at 6:03 a.m., standing alone in his study with his laptop open and Maria's email glowing on the screen, he came close. He had barely slept. Vanessa had gone to bed early, claiming exhaustion from the ordeal, and Richard had sat up in his study reviewing shipping contracts he couldn't focus on. His mind circling back again and again to the look on Maria's face. Not anger, not defensiveness, just a kind of quiet, exhausted despair, the look of someone who had learned long ago that her word would never weigh as much as someone else's tears. When the email arrived, he almost didn't open it. It was early, he was tired, and some small, cowardly part of him didn't want to know what it contained. But he opened it anyway because somewhere underneath 14 years of boardrooms and mergers and a life built increasingly around image rather than instinct, Richard Sterling still remembered what it felt like to be a person nobody believed. He watched the video once, then again, then a third time, frame by frame, his stomach turning colder with each replay. There it was. Vanessa's hand. The small packet. The deliberate motion. The 31-second delay before the performance of choking that had nearly cost a grieving family's most loyal caretaker her job, her son's scholarship reference, and 6 years of quiet devotion. Richard sat very still for a long time after the video ended. He thought about the 18 months before his mother died. Months he'd spent mostly on planes, mostly in meetings, mostly telling himself that providing money was a form of presence. He thought about the voicemail Maria had left him the night his mother passed. Her voice gentle even through her own grief, telling him Eleanor hadn't been afraid, that she'd been holding her hand, that she wasn't alone. He thought about how, in the 8 months since he'd started dating Vanessa, he had let 100 small unkindnesses slide past him. A dismissed housekeeper here, a snapped comment at a waiter there, because Vanessa was beautiful and charming and made him feel, for the first time since his mother's death, like his life still had color in it. He had mistaken charm for character. It was, he realized now, sitting alone in the gray dawn light, one of the oldest mistakes a person could make. At 7:30 a.m., Richard called Priya Shah directly. "I need everything," he said. "Every angle, every timestamp, unedited, sent to my personal email and backed up somewhere Vanessa can't access. And Priya, thank you for telling Maria, for not staying silent. She deserved to know the truth was there, sir. Everyone deserves that." At 8:15 a.m., Richard called Maria. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight with a particular exhaustion of someone who has spent an entire night rehearsing how they might lose everything. "Maria," Richard said, and his voice cracked slightly on her name. "I saw the video. Believe you. I am so sorry. For last night, for not stopping it sooner, for not seeing what was happening in my own house for the last 8 months. You have done nothing wrong. Nothing. Please, please come back today if you're willing. I need to make this right, and I need to do it in front of her." There was a long silence on the line. Maria pressed her hand against her chest, feeling something loosen there that had been tight since 7 o'clock the previous evening. "I'll come," she said finally. "For Diego. And because Eleanor would have wanted me to see this through." "There's something else," Richard said, his voice steadier now, resolve settling into it like ballast into a ship. "I want you at dinner tonight. Not serving it. Sitting at the table. I want Vanessa to understand exactly what she tried to take from someone, and exactly who was strong enough to survive it." Maria closed her eyes. 6 years of quiet, careful invisibility, and now, finally, a seat at the table. Not as a gift, but as the truth reclaiming its rightful place. "I'll be there," she said. The house felt different that evening, though nothing about it had physically changed. The same chandeliers, the same marble, the same long table set for dinner. But something in the air had shifted, the way weather shifts before a storm nobody's forecasted. A pressure, a stillness, a sense that something long buried was about to surface. Vanessa arrived downstairs at 7, radiant as always in emerald green, expecting an evening of quiet reconciliation, perhaps even a small apology from Richard for how dramatic the previous night had gotten. She had already decided, privately, that Maria's dismissal would be finalized this week. She'd even mentioned to a friend on the phone that morning, laughing lightly, "Some people just don't know how to read a room." What she did not expect, walking into the dining room, was to see Maria Gonzalez seated at the table. Not serving. Seated, in a simple navy dress, her hands folded in her lap. Her expression calm in a way that unsettled Vanessa more than any accusation could have. "What is she doing here?" Vanessa asked, her smile flickering but not yet breaking. "Sit down, Vanessa," Richard said. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it, a stillness, a finality, that made her hesitate before pulling out her chair. "Richard, I don't understand." "Last night," Richard said, "you accused Maria of tampering with your food. You said it in front of my staff, in front of paramedics, in front of me. You asked me to fire a woman who spent the last 18 months of my mother's life caring for her with more devotion than I managed to show in person." "Richard, I was choking." "You weren't," Richard said simply, and he set his laptop on the table, turning the screen toward her. "I have the security footage. All of it. Your hand on your own plate. Pack it. The 31 seconds before you started performing a medical emergency that 3 paramedics confirmed never actually existed." The color drained from Vanessa's face. Not the performed pallor of the night before, but something real this time. That footage is misleading, Richard. Cameras can be edited, you can't possibly believe. Priya Shah has run security for this family for 11 years. She has no reason to lie, and every reason to protect her job by staying silent. She came forward anyway, because she couldn't watch an innocent woman lose everything for something she didn't do. Richard's voice remained level, but his eyes had gone hard in a way Vanessa had never seen before, not once in 8 months. "I need you to explain to me, to both of us, why you did this." Vanessa's composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of something raw and frightened beneath the practiced calm. Then, just as quickly, it hardened into something colder. "You want to know why?" she said, her voice rising. "Because I heard you talking about a trust fund for her son." "A trust fund, Richard? For the housekeeper's kid? Do you know how many trust funds I've watched other women's children get while I—" She stopped herself, breathing hard, and for a moment the mask slipped entirely, revealing something underneath that looked almost like grief. "I grew up with nothing too, Richard. Nobody ever set up a trust fund for me. I earned every single thing I have. And I watched you look at her like she mattered more than the woman you're supposed to be marrying." The room went silent. Maria, watching quietly from her seat, felt something complicated stir in her chest. Not sympathy exactly, but a strange, aching recognition. She understood scarcity. She understood the fear of being overlooked. She simply had never let that fear turn into cruelty toward someone else who had less power than she did. "I understand fear, Vanessa," Maria said quietly, speaking for the first time. "I understand what it feels like to worry there won't be enough. Enough money, enough love, enough security, for the people you care about. But I would never take someone else's safety to protect my own. Not even to save myself." She looked at Richard, then back at Vanessa. "There's a difference between fighting for what you deserve and taking what belongs to someone else." Vanessa said nothing. Her jaw was tight, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall in front of either of them. Richard closed the laptop slowly. "The engagement is over, Vanessa. I'll have James help arrange your things to be moved out by the end of the week. I'm not going to make this ugly publicly. That's not who I want to be. But I need you to be gone." Vanessa left the estate that night with 2 suitcases and a silence that said more than any argument could have. Richard didn't watch her go. He sat at the dining table long after her car pulled away, staring at his own hands, feeling the strange hollow ache of a life that had just been rearranged in the space of 24 hours. Maria sat with him, quiet, patient, the way she had once sat with his mother through long nights of pain neither of them could fix. "I owe you more than an apology," Richard said finally. "I owe you 6 years of not seeing clearly. I was so wrapped up in rebuilding my life after my mother passed that I let the people who actually showed up for this family become invisible to me. You held her hand when I couldn't get on a plane in time. You've raised a son alone while working 2 buses worth of commute every single day. And I never once asked you how you were doing." "Not really." Maria's eyes softened. "You were grieving too, Mr. Sterling. Grief makes people blind sometimes. It's not an excuse, but it's not a sin either." "Please," he said. "After everything, call me Richard." She almost smiled. "Richard, then." He looked at her for a long moment, something forming behind his eyes. Not romance, nothing like that, but a kind of clarity, the sense of a debt long overdue finally coming into focus. "The trust fund I mentioned for Diego. I want to move forward with it. Not as charity. As something I should have done years ago, the moment my mother passed and I understood what you'd given this family. Full tuition whatever school accepts him through college. And I want to formally promote you. Not as household staff, but as director of the Eleanor Sterling Foundation. I've been meaning to start it for 2 years and never got around to it. Community support programs, scholarship funds for kids like Diego, caregiver support networks for families going through what my mother went through. Nobody would run it better than someone who actually lived what it's meant to help." Maria's eyes filled finally with tears she'd been holding back through a night, a day, and a week of impossible pressure. "Richard, I never expected anything in return for taking care of your mother. I did it because she deserved it. Because every person deserves that kind of care at the end." "I know," Richard said gently. "That's exactly why you're the right person to lead this. Not despite the fact that you never asked for anything. Because of it." 3 weeks passed. The mansion, once filled with Vanessa's carefully curated elegance, began to feel different. Warmer somehow, less like a museum and more like a home actually being lived in. Diego's scholarship interview came and went. He walked into that private academy's admissions office with a reference letter from Richard Sterling himself, describing not just Maria's employment history, but her character. Her quiet strength, her unwavering integrity, the 18 months she'd spent caring for a dying woman with more devotion than money could ever buy. Diego was accepted with a full scholarship, plus the additional support of the newly established trust fund covering books, supplies, and everything in between. When Maria told him the news, sitting at their small kitchen table in the apartment they still lived in, though not for much longer, Diego had cried. Not from the scholarship alone, but from watching his mother's face as she told him. 6 years of silent sacrifice, finally visibly rewarded. "Mom," he said, "you never told me it was this hard. The buses, the long hours, all of it. I didn't want you carrying my worries," Maria said, wiping her eyes. "A mother's job is to carry what she can so her children can dream bigger than she was allowed to. You dreamed big enough for both of us," Diego said. "I just didn't know it until now." Meanwhile, the story of what had happened at the Sterling estate, carefully, respectfully, without a hint of scandal or gossip, began to circulate quietly among Richard's social circle. Not as tabloid fodder, but as something closer to a parable. A man who had almost let charm blind him to character. A woman who had nearly lost everything to a lie, and instead gained something far more lasting than her old position. Recognition, respect, and a mission worthy of everything she'd already given. Vanessa Cole moved to Los Angeles 2 months later. Richard heard secondhand that she'd returned to modeling, chasing the kind of attention that had always felt safer to her than genuine connection. He didn't wish her ill. He simply understood now that some people mistake taking for earning, and that mistake left unchecked eventually costs them everything that actually matters. The Eleanor Sterling Foundation launched formally in early spring, in a modest community center in the same neighborhood where Maria had raised Diego for the past decade. Not in some glittering downtown gala, because Maria had insisted, gently but firmly, that a foundation meant to serve working families shouldn't debut somewhere those families would feel out of place. Richard stood at the front of a small crowd. Caregivers, single parents, kids on the edge of opportunities they'd never quite been able to reach, and watched Maria step up to the podium in a simple gray blazer. Her hands steady now in a way they hadn't been the night broken glass had scattered across the Sterling dining room floor. 6 years ago, Maria began, her voice carrying clearly through the small room. I walked into a house I didn't belong in, to care for a woman I'd never met, doing work most people don't think to thank you for. I learned something in that house I didn't expect to learn. I learned that dignity isn't given to you by other people's opinions of you. It's something you carry inside yourself and you protect it, even when, especially when, no one else is protecting it for you. She looked out at the crowd, at faces that reminded her of her own reflection a decade earlier, tired and uncertain and hoping for something better for their children. This foundation exists because a woman named Eleanor Sterling showed me, in her final months, what it looks like to be truly seen by another human being, even when your body is failing you. And it exists because her son, she glanced at Richard, a small, genuine smile crossing her face, finally learned to see the people around him the same way his mother once did. Richard felt his throat tighten. He thought of his mother's hand in Maria's, all those nights he wasn't there. He thought of how close he'd come to losing something irreplaceable, not because he was a cruel man, but because he'd been a distracted one, mistaking proximity to wealth and beauty for closeness to what actually mattered. The foundation's first initiative was a caregiver support fund, financial assistance and mental health resources for family caregivers and home health workers, the invisible backbone of countless households who rarely received recognition for the weight they carried. Its second initiative was a scholarship program for children of essential workers, funding education the way Diego's had been funded, quietly and completely, without strings or spectacle. A year passed. Diego thrived at his new school, excelling particularly in science, talking excitedly at dinner about wanting to become a doctor. The kind that actually sits with people, he told his mother one evening, not just the kind that writes prescriptions and leaves. Maria had laughed and cried in the same breath, recognizing her own values reflected back at her through her son's growing ambitions. Maria herself had transformed the Eleanor Sterling Foundation into something far larger than anyone initially imagined. Partnerships with 3 hospital systems for caregiver support, scholarship funds reaching over 200 students in its first year alone, and a growing reputation as one of the most effective grassroots philanthropic organizations in the state. She still rode public transportation most days, though now by choice rather than necessity, saying it kept her close to the people the foundation was actually built for. Richard, for his part, found himself changed in quieter ways. He spent less time chasing deals that made headlines and more time actually present in the life he'd built, visiting the foundation's programs personally, learning caregivers' names, remembering birthdays of people who worked for him rather than simply signing their bonus checks. He never remarried, not in that first year, though there were quiet whispers among friends that a warm, steady friendship had grown between him and Maria. Nothing rushed, nothing performative, just 2 people who had weathered something difficult together and come out the other side with a rare, earned respect for one another. "People ask me sometimes," Richard said in an interview about the foundation's first anniversary, "why I trust Maria Gonzalez's judgment on nearly everything now, personal and professional. And I tell them, because she never once, in 6 years, asked for anything for herself. Not once. The people who deserve your trust most are usually the ones who never demanded it." On the 2nd anniversary of the Eleanor Sterling Foundation, Maria stood once more at a podium, this time in front of a crowd nearly 10 times larger than the first, addressing donors, former scholarship recipients now in college, caregivers whose lives had been eased by the fund's support. She thought, standing there, about that night 2 years earlier. The shattered water pitcher, the pointed finger, the terror of losing everything because someone with more power had decided her silence was worth less than their comfort. She thought about how close that single dinner had come to erasing 6 years of quiet devotion, and how instead, it had become the beginning of something neither she nor Richard could have imagined. "I used to believe," she told the crowd, her voice steady and warm, "that the people who work hardest are often the ones least seen. I still believe that's true for far too many people in this country. The caregivers, the housekeepers, the bus drivers, the people holding entire families together with exhausted hands and very little recognition. But I've also learned something else. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs one person brave enough to look at it honestly, even when a comfortable lie would have been easier." She looked out at Diego, sitting in the front row in his school blazer, beaming with a pride that made her chest ache with love. She looked at Richard, standing near the back of the room as he always insisted on doing now, letting others take the spotlight he'd spent so many years chasing. "To anyone out there who feels invisible right now," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion, "who feels like your hard work goes unnoticed, like your dignity depends on someone else's willingness to see it, I promise you it doesn't. Your worth was never something someone else had the power to take from you. It was always yours. Sometimes it just takes the right moment and the right witness, for the rest of the world to finally catch up to what you already knew about yourself." The room rose in applause, and somewhere in that applause was a lesson worth carrying long after the story ends, that kindness offered without expectation of return has a way of finding its way back, often when we need it most, and that the truth, however long it stays buried, has a way of surfacing exactly when it matters. If this story moved you even a little, give it a like, it helps more than you know. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, real, emotional, human stories about the quiet strength it takes to keep going when no one's watching. And if you know someone who could use a little hope today, someone who feels unseen, someone who's been carrying more than their share of the weight, send this story their way. You never know whose life it might touch. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.